My daughter-in-law stole my grandmother's diamond brooch, and my own son lied to the police to protect her. But when I uncovered the pawn ticket with her signature, I didn't beg for an apology. I made sure they both faced the consequences. Officer, my mother misplaces things all the time, so I wouldn't file a report just yet. Those exact words came from my son Brian as he stood in my living room looking directly at the police officer while ignoring the empty velvet tray on my dresser. My grandmother's diamond brooch, valued at around $4,500, was gone. It wasn't a fortune, but it was my most cherished family heirloom. I stood there, 58 years old, feeling the room tilt beneath my worn slippers. Just an hour earlier, my daughter-in-law Jessica had finished sweeping the hallway near my bedroom while helping me clean after Sunday lunch. When I noticed the drawer slightly open and the brooch missing, I naturally panicked. I called Brian first expecting support. Instead, he brought the police himself not to investigate, but to control the damage. "She's getting older, officer." Brian added his voice, smooth, calculated, and entirely fake. I watched him shield Jessica, who stood behind him with her arms crossed, looking at her polished nails without a trace of guilt. That was the exact second something inside me snapped cleanly in two. For 3 years, I had swallowed small slights, overlooked passive-aggressive comments, and played the quiet, understanding mother who never wanted to cause trouble. I thought being the bigger person was a virtue. I thought keeping the peace meant keeping my family together. But looking at my only son lying to a police officer to protect his wife from even being questioned, I realized I wasn't being big. I was just being trampled. The officer looked between us, sensing the thick tension, and asked if I wanted to proceed with an official report. I swallowed the lump in my throat, looked Brian dead in the eye, and took my first real step toward myself. The officer left after taking a basic report, promising nothing without hard evidence. The moment the front door clicked shut, the air in my home turned to ice. "Mom, why are you doing this?" Brian demanded, tossing his jacket onto my sofa, as if he owned the place. "Jessica was just trying to help you dust the bedrooms. You're embarrassing us over a piece of old metal." Jessica stepped forward, her voice dripping with artificial pity. "Helen, if you're struggling financially or having memory lapses, you can just tell us. We're family." That was their favorite weapon, framing my boundaries as mental decline or bitterness. I sat down at my kitchen table, my hands remarkably steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. Looking back, the signs had been there since they married 2 years ago. I had made mistakes too. Early on, I had been overbearing, offering unsolicited advice about their budgeting and how they managed their suburban home. I wasn't a saint. I knew my habit of checking up on Brian had driven a wedge between us initially. But I had backed off. I had apologized for my intrusiveness and tried to build a clean slate. Jessica, however, used my past overstepping as permanent leverage. Every boundary I set was labeled as mother-in-law interference. Every time I asked for respect, Brian accused me of hating his wife. I looked at the coffee cups left on the counter from their visit cups I had poured, hosted, and paid for. I had rationalized their disrespect for months, telling myself that young couples need space, that in-law dynamics are always rocky, and that a good mother endures the sting for her child's happiness. But sitting across from them now, I saw the truth clearly. Brian hadn't chosen his wife out of love. He had chosen the path of least resistance, even if it meant stepping on his mother to walk it. They left that afternoon with a heavy, angry silence, convinced they had intimidated me into dropping the matter. They thought I would call them in 2 days and apologize for making a scene just as I had done after last Thanksgiving's argument. But they didn't know about the folder sitting in my filing cabinet. 4 years ago, after my husband passed away, I had co-signed a $25,000 personal loan for Brian to consolidate his college debt and start his landscaping business. The loan was entirely in my name with the credit union, though Brian had an informal written agreement with me to pay the $450 monthly installment directly into my secondary account. Over the last 6 months, those payments had been late short or missed entirely. Each time Brian had offered a hasty excuse about equipment repairs or slow clients, and each time I had quietly covered the difference from my modest savings as a high school librarian to protect his credit score. I opened the steel cabinet in my study and pulled out the blue ledger. I sat under the desk lamp reviewing the numbers. I wasn't rich. I lived off my pension and my late husband's small annuity, managing a modest 2-bedroom home in Ohio. Every dollar I threw into Brian's missed payments was a dollar pulled from my own retirement security. I realized then how my generosity had actually enabled his disrespect. By constantly safety netting his life, I had taught him that my sacrifices were free and my dignity was cheap. I took out a pen, noted every missing payment down to the cent, and called my attorney, Mr. Alvarez. I didn't want revenge. I wanted accounting. It was time to stop funding my own mistreatment under the guise of maternal love. 2 days later, I took a morning off from the library and drove down to the commercial district near the highway. I knew Jessica's habits better than she thought. She was impulsive when she needed quick cash for her boutique shopping trips, and she preferred fast transactions over careful planning. There were 3 licensed pawn shops within a 5-mile radius of our town. At the second shop, a dusty storefront with metal bars on the windows, I spoke with the manager, a calm man named Sam. I showed him a clear photograph of my grandmother's brooch from an old family album, along with the original insurance appraisal from 10 years ago. Sam looked at the photo, then looked at me, his expression shifting to quiet recognition. "A young woman brought this in late yesterday afternoon," he said quietly. "Showed a driver's license matching your town. Said it was an inheritance from her aunt." My heart hammered against my ribs, but I didn't cry. The manager pulled out the intake log. Jessica had signed her real name, provided her ID, and taken $800 in cash for a piece worth nearly 6 times that amount. Sam explained that by law, he had to hold pawned items for 30 days before listing them for sale, and because there was now an active police report number, he was required to notify the detective assigned to my case. I thanked him, walked out to my sedan, and sat in the quiet car for a long time. The proof was absolute, concrete, and undisputed. Yet as I sat there gripping the steering wheel, I felt a deep, hollow ache. Proving I was right didn't bring joy. It only confirmed the total collapse of my relationship with my son. He had stood in my hallway and accused me of losing my mind, fully aware of what his wife was capable of. Instead of calling the police to make an immediate arrest at Jessica's workplace, I requested a meeting at my house the following Sunday. I invited Brian alone, but as expected, Jessica came with him, walking in with her chin held high, wearing a coat of defensive arrogance. She brought a store-bought apple pie, setting it on my kitchen counter as a shallow peace offering. "Helen, we came because Brian insisted, but we really need to move past this paranoia." She started setting her handbag down. "It's not healthy for you to harbor these suspicions." I let her finish. I didn't interrupt, I didn't raise my voice, and I didn't display a shred of anger. I simply walked over to the dining table, where 3 items were laid out neatly: a copy of the police report, a printout of the pawn shop's signed intake form bearing Jessica's signature and driver's license number, and the formal bank ledger showing $2,700 in missed loan repayments from Brian. Brian walked over to the table, his eyes scanning the documents. The color drained from his face so fast it was almost frightening. He looked at Jessica, whose mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. "Jessica, what is this?" Brian whispered, his voice cracking. "She's setting me up. That's a fake paper." Jessica yelled, her composure shattering into desperate anger. "Your mother has hated me since day one. She probably sold it herself to ruin our marriage." I looked at Brian, waiting to see if he would finally step into reality. For 10 seconds, the room was dead silent. Brian looked from the signed pawn ticket to his wife's panicked face, and then at me. But instead of holding her accountable, his face hardened into ugly resentment directed straight at me. "Why couldn't you just let it go, Mom?" he snapped, his voice trembling. She made a mistake. We were short on rent. You have savings, you don't need that brooch. Why do you have to destroy my life over this? His response was the final piece of the puzzle. He didn't care about the truth. He cared about his comfort. If destroying my peace kept his marriage quiet, he was more than willing to pay with my dignity. I stood up from the table, feeling a strange, solid calm settle over my shoulders. I didn't destroy your life, Brian. You traded your integrity piece by piece, and Jessica signed her name to it. I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of the emotional tremble he was used to. The police detective has already been notified by the pawnshop manager. It is no longer in my hands to drop or pursue. The state handles felony theft. Jessica burst into tears, no longer arrogant but terrified of the real-world consequences of her actions. Helen, please, she sobbed. I'll get it back. I'll pay you. You won't pay me anything, I replied. You will deal with the legal system. Brian stepped forward, trying to use his height to intimidate me, as he often did during arguments. If you do this to my wife, Mom, you lose me forever. Do you understand? I will walk out that door and you will never see me or any future grandchildren. Is an old piece of jewelry worth your family? A year ago, that threat would have brought me to my knees, begging for forgiveness and making excuses for them. Today, it sounded like a hollow echo. I looked at my son, this man I had raised, fed, put through school, and constantly shielded from his own poor choices. Brian, I said softly, you lost me the moment you lied to the police in my hallway. You may leave my house now. 3 days later, Jessica was formally processed at the county precinct for grand larceny due to the value of the stolen item. Because it was a first-time offense, her lawyer managed to negotiate a pre-trial diversion program that required full restitution community service and a formal record that would take years to expunge if she completed probation. The brooch was recovered and returned to me by the department, resting back in its box, though its emotional shine was permanently tarnished. Meanwhile, I didn't stop at the police report. I met with Mr. Alvarez to handle the financial side of our broken relationship. I officially transferred the remaining $22,000 personal loan balance into a formal collection structure. Through my attorney, Brian was served with a legal notice requiring him to make his monthly loan payments directly to the credit union under strict binding terms, removing me entirely as his personal buffer. If he missed a payment, it would directly hit his commercial credit rating and his business assets, not my bank account. When he received the court-stamped papers, he called me 12 times in one afternoon. I didn't answer a single call. I sent one short professional email. All future communications regarding financial obligations must go through Mr. Alvarez's office. Do not come to my home. For the first time in my adult life, I set a boundary that had teeth. It felt terrifying, but underneath the fear was a profound sense of relief. I was no longer paying for the privilege of being abused. As expected, the family fallout was swift and brutal. My sister-in-law, Karen, called me later that week, her voice thick with judgment. Helen, how could you put your own daughter-in-law through the court system? People are talking. Brian is stressed out of his mind trying to pay these legal fees, and his business is suffering. You're being cruel. I listened to her without interrupting. In the past, I would have spent an hour explaining myself, showing evidence, and desperately seeking her approval. Karen, I said calmly, Jessica stole a priceless family heirloom from my bedroom and pawned it for pocket money. Brian lied to the police to cover it up. If you feel so strongly about their financial stress, you are more than welcome to co-sign Brian's loans yourself. Karen went silent on the other end of the line, completely unprepared for me to push back. Well, that's different, she stammered. No, it isn't, I said. You want me to suffer quietly so the family looks nice from the outside. I am no longer accepting that role. I hung up the phone without waiting for her reply. Word spread quickly through our extended circle that I was no longer the soft, easily manipulated widow who could be pushed around. Some relatives distanced themselves, unable to handle a woman who refused to play the martyr. Others, surprisingly, sent quiet texts of support, admitting they had seen Brian's entitled behavior for years. I realized then that when you stop being the carpet, people walk on you quickly find out who actually respected you and who just liked how convenient you were. A month after the court hearing, a thick envelope arrived in my mailbox. It was a letter from Brian, written on his business stationery. It wasn't an apology. It was a long list of grievances. He brought up things from 10 years ago, how I had been too strict during his high school years, how I had criticized his choice of college major, how I had made Jessica feel unwelcome at our first Christmas together by asking her about her career plans. He wrote that my unforgiving nature was driving him to drink, and that if I wanted any relationship with him in the future, I needed to drop the loan enforcement, pay Jessica's legal fees, and apologize to them both in front of the family. I sat at my desk with a cup of tea, reading his words carefully. 5 years ago, this letter would have shattered my soul. I would have dissected every sentence, wondering where I had failed as a mother, carrying the crushing weight of maternal guilt. But reading it now, I saw it for what it truly was, the desperate tactic of an adult child who had never been forced to face consequences. He was trying to use my past imperfections to justify his current cruelty. I didn't write back. I didn't call him to debate his memory of high school. I folded the letter, placed it inside my desk drawer next to the police report, and locked it away. I didn't burn it, nor did I cry over it. It became a neutral historical record, proof of the bridge he chose to burn, while holding the match himself. It has been 6 months now since the day my brooch disappeared. My home is quiet, sometimes too quiet, but it is a clean, honest silence. Jessica is completing her court-mandated community service, and Brian is making his monthly loan payments on time to the credit union forced into responsibility by the cold mechanics of legal contracts rather than respect for his mother. We do not speak. I attend my book club, I tend to my garden, and I continue my work at the high school library, surrounded by young people who are still learning how to navigate the world. I often think about that phrase, being the bigger person. For decades, I believed it meant swallowing poison, so others wouldn't have to taste their own medicine. I thought it meant enduring disrespect, making excuses for bad behavior, and calling it unconditional love. I was wrong. Being the bigger person doesn't mean shrinking yourself until you're invisible. It means standing tall enough to see your own worth, setting firm boundaries, and allowing adults, even your own children, to harvest the exact seeds they have planted. I miss the son I thought I had, and I grieve the family dynamic I wished we could have built. But I do not miss the anxiety, the disrespect, or the constant walking on eggshells in my own home. I lost a son's presence, but I reclaimed my life, my self-respect, and my peace. And in the end, that was a trade I was finally brave enough to make.
All came on a Tuesday morning, and I remember because I was standing at my kitchen counter trying to figure out if the coffee maker had finally given up on me or if I had just forgotten to press the button again. I'm 63 years old. I forget things. I press the wrong button sometimes, but I never, not once in 38 years of being a mother, forgot to show up. My son, he'll be 41 this October, called me at 8:17 in the morning. I know the exact time because I just glanced at the clock on the microwave, the one that's been blinking 12:00 since the power went out during that storm in March. I'd set a real clock next to it just so I could stop guessing what time it was. That's the kind of thing you do when you live alone. You learn little workarounds. "Mom," he said, and his voice had that particular quality it gets when he's about to ask me something and he already knows he shouldn't be asking it. I'd heard that voice when he was 17 and had crashed the car. I'd heard it when he was 24 and needed money for a deposit on an apartment. I knew that voice the way I knew the sound of rain before it actually starts. That low pressure in the air. That particular stillness. "Mom, about the graduation dinner Saturday." I waited. Priscilla thinks it might be better if it was just the two of us, her and me. She says her parents are coming in from Phoenix, and they want it to be more of an intimate thing, just their side of the family, and I'm sorry, I said. I wasn't sorry. I just needed him to stop talking for a second so I could catch up to what I was hearing. The graduation dinner, the one I've been planning since February. I know, Mom. The one I've already paid the deposit on, at Castellan's. A pause. We can work out the deposit. I set my coffee mug down on the counter, very carefully, because if I didn't set it down carefully, I wasn't sure what I would do with it. Let me back up. Let me tell you about my son, because none of what happened makes sense without you understanding who he is and who I raised him to be, or who I thought I was raising him to be. I had him when I was 22, just married, full of that particular brand of optimism that only exists before life starts teaching you things. His father and I divorced when my son was 9. It wasn't ugly, but it wasn't easy either. His father moved to Portland, called on birthdays sometimes, came to graduation, shook hands, took photos, went back to Portland. My son grew up largely with me in a 3-bedroom house in a suburb of Columbus, Ohio, where I worked as a dental hygienist for 22 years. And then, when my back started arguing with me about bending over people's mouths all day, transitioned into office management for the same practice. I was not a woman of means. I was a woman of careful budgeting. I was a woman who bought the store brand and clipped coupons and said no to herself every single day so that I could say yes to him. I paid for his college, 4 years at Ohio State. Not a full ride. I couldn't do a full ride, but I covered the parts that scholarships didn't. I took out a second mortgage on my house at 51 years old, and I did not tell him that until years later because I didn't want him to feel guilty. I wanted him to feel free. Maybe that was my first mistake. Maybe letting someone walk around feeling free when you are, in fact, carrying the weight behind them does them a disservice. Maybe they need to know the weight exists, or they'll never learn to carry anything themselves. He graduated with a degree in business administration, met Priscilla at a company event 2 years later, and was engaged within 18 months. I liked her well enough at first. She was polished, well-spoken, came from a family in Scottsdale with what I'll simply call different expectations than mine. Her mother had never worked. Her father played golf 3 times a week and had opinions about wine regions that he shared at length. They weren't unkind to me, exactly. They were just very comfortable with me existing in a category that was not quite their category. The engagement party was at their club. I sat at a table near the kitchen with Priscilla's aunt from Tucson and a cousin who spent the entire evening on his phone. Nobody from my son's side was seated with me. When I mentioned this to him afterward, gently, he said Priscilla had handled the seating and he hadn't really been involved. I told myself that was fine. When the wedding planning started, my son came to me in the kitchen. My kitchen, the same one where I used to help him with math homework, where I used to pack his lunches, and he sat down and he said, "Mom, we're going to need some help." The wedding was to be held at an estate venue outside Columbus, 300 guests. A 4-piece band, not a DJ, because Priscilla's mother felt that DJs were a certain kind of choice. The flowers alone were going to cost more than my car. Her parents were contributing what they described as substantially, and my son said this with complete seriousness, as if I should simply nod and also contribute substantially. I asked what substantially meant. He showed me the budget spreadsheet. Her parents were covering the venue and catering. Everything else. Flowers, photography, the rehearsal dinner, the honeymoon flight credits, Priscilla's dress alterations. A second dress she wanted for the reception was in what the spreadsheet labeled, I am not making this up, supplemental funding. I was the supplemental funding. I was 62 years old at that point, retired from the dental office, living on a modest retirement and my savings. I had $220,000 in savings that I had spent 40 years accumulating, that I had planned to use to pay off the second mortgage and maybe, eventually, have something to leave behind for him, for grandchildren someday. I gave him a $190,000. I want you to understand that I sat with that number for 3 days before I agreed. I ran it through my mind every which way. I prayed about it. I called my sister, the only person I trusted with the real numbers. And she said, "You're out of your mind." And I said, "I know, but he's my son." And she went quiet in the way that meant she thought I was making a mistake. But she knew she couldn't stop me. I gave him $190,000 because I loved him and I wanted to give him a beautiful start, and because some part of me still believed, despite evidence that was beginning to accumulate, that this was a transaction of love that would be repaid, not in dollars, but in the currency of family, of belonging, of a son who would always make sure his mother had a seat at the table. I did not anticipate that the table would have a specific, limited guest list. The call on the Tuesday morning, 4 days before the graduation dinner, his MBA graduation, the one I had also partially funded, the program that cost $47,000 that he'd said he needed to advance his career. That call was not my first indication that something had shifted, but it was the clearest. "Priscilla thinks it might be better. Your wife thinks I shouldn't come to celebrate your graduation. It's not that you shouldn't come, it's just that her parents flew in and they want—" "I'd like to hear you say it," I said. "Not Priscilla thinks. You. Do you want me there?" The pause that followed told me everything I needed to know. "It's complicated, Mom. I had funded this man's entire life. I had paid for the education he was about to celebrate. I had given him money that I could not replace, money that lived in spreadsheets under a label that did not include my name, money that bought flowers for a wedding where I was seated near the kitchen and handed a seating assignment like a stranger." "Okay," I said. Just that. Okay. Because I had learned something in 63 years that nobody tells you when you're young and you're handing everything you have to the people you love. Sometimes the kindest, truest thing you can do for yourself and, eventually, for them is to stop softening the edges of a situation that needs to be sharp. I hung up the phone. I finished making my coffee. I sat at my kitchen table and I looked out the window at the backyard where I'd pushed him on a swing set for what felt like half my 30s. And I made some decisions. The first call I made was to my attorney. Her name is Beverly Osei, and she has been my attorney for 11 years. And she's the kind of woman who does not waste words or expressions on things that don't require them. I told her what I needed. She said she would draw up the paperwork. The second call I made was to my bank. The cashier's checks I had written, 2 of them, totaling the $190,000. Some of those payments were still processing, some were pending. My banker walked me through what was reversible and what wasn't. Not all of it was reversible and what wasn't. Not all of it was reversible, but enough of it was. The third call I made was to my sister. She said, "It's about time. Here is what happened when he found out. And I want to tell you this part carefully, because it's the part that people always want to know. Did he come crawling back? Did he apologize? Was there a dramatic scene at someone's front door?" And the truth is that life is almost never as cinematic as we want it to be. He found out 2 days before the dinner when the florist called him to confirm delivery and he discovered that the payment had been reversed. Then he called the rehearsal dinner venue and discovered the same thing. Then his wife called me from a number I didn't recognize, which told me she was calling from her phone because she knew I wouldn't pick up if I saw my son's name. I picked up anyway. "I don't know what you think you're doing," she said, and her voice was very controlled in the way that means someone is actually furious underneath the control. "We have contracts. We have vendors who are expecting payment." "Yes," I said. "I imagine you do. This is incredibly selfish." I thought about that word, selfish. I had given that word a lot of real estate in my mind over the years. Every time I'd said no to myself and yes to someone else, I'd been terrified of the word selfish appearing on my door like a scarlet letter. I donated years of my life and the entire content of my savings account and endless hours of worry and prayer and showing up to avoid that word. "Your parents are in town," I said. "They'll be at the dinner. I'm sure between the 2 families you can cover what's needed." She said some other things. I let her say them. Then I said, "Priscilla, I hope you have a lovely graduation dinner," and I hung up. My son came to my house that evening. He looked like he hadn't slept, which was probably true. He stood on my porch and I could see in his face something I hadn't seen in a long time. Not the entitled, half-distracted expression he'd been wearing for the past 2 years, but something younger, Something that looked more like the boy who used to sit on the kitchen floor and tell me about his day while I cooked dinner. "Mom," he said, "can I come in?" I held the door open. We sat at the kitchen table. He didn't say anything for a while. I didn't either. Outside, the neighbor's dog was barking at something in the yard, and the refrigerator made that humming sound it makes when it's working too hard. "I don't know when I stopped treating you like my mother," he finally said. "I do," I said. "It was gradual." But I watched it happen. He put his face in his hands. I had a complicated response to that. On one hand, he was still my child, and some part of me wanted to put my hand on his back the way I had when he was small and overwhelmed by the world. On the other hand, he was a 41-year-old man with an MBA and a wife and a house that I'd helped pay for, and he had, 4 days ago, effectively told me he preferred me not to attend the celebration of his own success. "Priscilla," he started. "I need you to stop beginning sentences that way," I said quietly. "You are not Priscilla. You have your own mind. You make your own choices. You chose to call me and tell me not to come. That was your choice." He didn't argue. That was something. What followed was not a single tearful reconciliation scene. That's not how this works, and I want to be honest with you about that, because I think we do each other a disservice when we expect life to tie itself up in 2 hours with a meaningful score underneath it. What followed was a series of conversations, difficult ones, over several weeks. My attorney had already changed my estate documents. I had no plans to reverse that immediately. My son needed to sit with some consequences for a while, and so did I. What I told him that night at the kitchen table was this: "I am your mother. I will always be your mother. But I am also a person, and that person has limits. And I should have taught you those limits a long time ago. What I did instead was remove every obstacle so you'd never have to feel uncomfortable. And what I created was a son who had no idea his mother could be uncomfortable too. That ends now. Not because I'm punishing you, because it has to." He cried. I'm not going to pretend he didn't. And I sat there, dry-eyed, because I had done my crying in the weeks before this, alone in my bedroom, grieving something that I was finally ready to stop grieving. I want to tell you one more thing, because it's the part I've thought about the most since everything happened. When I gave him that $190,000, I thought I was giving him a gift. What I was actually giving him was a permission slip to keep not seeing me. Every time I absorbed a cost he should have questioned. Every time I said don't worry about it when I was very much worrying about it, I was telling him, the rules are different for you. You don't have to show up. You don't have to look at me. I'll still be here. I'll still pay. Mothers are told from the moment we hold our children that love means sacrifice, and it does. But sacrifice without boundaries doesn't build strong people. It builds people who don't know what things cost, not just in dollars, but in the human energy and time and dignity of the people who love them. I graduated from that too, in a way. Not from loving him. I'll never graduate from that. But from the particular, damaging belief that love means making yourself invisible so someone else can be comfortable. The graduation dinner happened. His in-laws paid for it. My son told me later it was fine, nothing special. The florist they scrambled to replace wasn't as good as the original one. I don't say that with satisfaction. I say it because it happened. He came to see me the following Sunday without his wife, and we had lunch. He asked me about my savings, not to get something, but because he'd apparently done some math and realized, for the first time, what it had actually cost me. He went quiet for a long time after I told him what my bank balance looked like. "Mom," he said, "I'm going to pay you back." "You don't have to," I said. "I want to," he said. "I need to." I told him we'd figure it out. What I really meant was that the money wasn't the point. It had never been the point. The point was whether my son could become the kind of man who understood, finally, that his mother was a person with weight and limits and value that had nothing to do with what she could fund. We're still working on it. I want to be honest about that too. There's no ending yet, where everything is fixed and the music swells, and he's suddenly transformed. He's trying. I think Priscilla is adjusting to a version of me that doesn't disappear when inconvenient. My sister says I look better than I've looked in years. I pressed the right button on the coffee maker this morning, remembered on the first try. Small things. But I'm learning to count them. I've been sitting with this story for a while now, trying to figure out how to say the last part. Not the part where I called the bank, not the part where my son showed up at my door, but the part underneath all of it, the part that actually matters. Here's what I've come to understand. What happened between my son and me wasn't really about the $190,000. It wasn't about the dinner or the flowers, or whether his wife liked me or didn't. All of that was just the surface of something that had been building for years, quietly, the way water gets into a foundation. You don't see the damage until one day a wall cracks. The damage started with me. I need to say that plainly. Every time I wrote a check without asking for accountability, every time I absorbed a cost I shouldn't have absorbed alone, every time I said don't worry about it when I was very much worrying about it, I was teaching him something. I was teaching him that I had no edges, that I was infinitely available, that he could place his weight on me without ever checking whether I could still stand. That's not love. It looks like love. It feels like love when you're doing it, because you're so afraid of the alternative, of your child feeling unsupported or struggling or thinking you didn't give enough. But what I was actually doing was removing every consequence from his life until he had no idea what things cost. Not just money, everything. Effort, gratitude, basic human decency. The thing about consequences is that they are not punishments. People get those two things confused. When I reversed those payments, when I called Beverly and had the paperwork drawn up, I wasn't punishing my son. I was finally, at 63 years old, allowing reality to reach him. I was stepping out of the way of the very thing he needed in order to grow. He is not a bad person. I want to be clear about that. He's a person who was never required to look clearly at anything, including his own mother, because I had always made it easy not to look. When you remove all the friction from someone's life, you also remove the moments where they have to stop and reckon with who they're becoming. Friction is how we learn. Resistance is how we develop the kind of character that can carry weight without crumbling. Priscilla called me selfish. I've turned that word over many times. What I know now is that there is a version of selflessness that is actually a kind of cowardice, a fear of being seen as difficult, as demanding, as someone who takes up space. I had been practicing that cowardice for decades, calling it love, and the bill had come due in the form of a phone call that told me I wasn't welcome at my own son's celebration. The moment I stopped being afraid of the word selfish was the moment I started being useful to both of us. My son is trying now. I see it. It's not fast and it's not smooth, and there are still Sundays where I hang up the phone and sit quietly for a while before I feel okay. But he is trying, and that trying is worth something precisely because it is costing him something. For the first time, he's doing the work without a check from me waiting at the end of it. That's what I wanted for him all along. I just didn't know that giving him everything was the thing standing in the way.